Hello everyone, Mr. Randolph here. In this video I want to go over some general patterns of inheritance. So just continuing on with our genetics unit here, these are different patterns or different mechanisms of really the expression of certain traits and certain characteristics in individuals. And so there's several different ones that I want to go over here. I'm really just going to kind of explain how these characteristics are exhibited or how they're expressed in individuals in these different patterns that we see here. Later on in some other videos I'll go over some Punnett squares and show you guys how we can actually determine what pattern of inheritance we're looking at based on an image like what we see here, these pedigrees and following traits down family trees or down bloodlines. And so here, though, I just want to give you the terms and the names of these so that you know what we're talking about later on. The first one, and this is the one that you're probably familiar with if you've done genetics before, if you've seen this in some earlier grades, is what we call complete dominance. Complete dominance pattern of inheritance is where one allele is a dominant allele. This is what Mendel was looking at with his pea plants. Lucky for us and lucky for Mendel, the specific characteristics that he was observing are shown through a complete dominance type of situation here. We don't see a lot of that in most genes. There's a lot of different complex patterns of inheritance and different things that can influence the way that genes are expressed. But some of those ones, for example, in humans, is a widow's peak. Scientists do believe right now that widow's peaks are controlled by one specific gene, and there's two versions of that, where you'd have the widow's peak, which is what we see right here, this kind of point in the hairline, versus a straight hairline, which is what we see in this picture right here. And so a widow's peak would be the dominant trait. So if the person has the widow's peak gene, that specific allele, it's going to be expressed, whether they're homozygous for that or they're heterozygous for that specific gene. So the complete dominant situation, that is going to be expressed. That particular characteristic will be expressed in the homozygous dominant individuals as well as the heterozygous individuals. So as long as it's there, you're going to see it. The next version or pattern that we would look at would be incomplete dominance. It's just kind of what the name implies there, that neither allele is going to be dominant in place of another. We see this a lot in snapdragons. Snapdragons are a particular type of flower that express incomplete dominance when we talk about flower color. And in this case, since neither particular allele is dominant, what we see is that they blend together in the heterozygote. And so in the image that we have here, we have two different snapdragons. One has a red flower and one has a white flower. If these were to cross-pollinate, would end up with a pink flower. The pink isn't a different version of the gene, it's just a blending of the two. And so what we have here is a homozygous red flower, a homozygous white flower, and since they have both of those versions of the genes, both of those particular pigments are going to be produced in that flower, and the offspring down here, this first generation offspring here would produce pink flowers. They blend together. It's not, like I said, it's not another version of the gene, it's just a combination of the two. And that's what we call incomplete dominance. Neither gene or neither allele is dominant versus the other one. The next pattern that I want to look at is codominance. Codominance means just that both of the alleles are going to be dominant at the same time. And so a common example that you see of this is referring to shorthorn red cattle and shorthorn white cattle. Should change this. This is not necessarily a recessive trait. They're both codominant here. And so we have a shorthorn red, and we can see that its coat color is a reddish color. The shorthorn white is red here. But and this is a homozygous individual. It's homozygous for red, homozygous for white. And if they were to reproduce, with those genes combined, we end up having what's referred to as roan cattle. The shorthorn roan shows both versions of the gene. It shows the red allele and the white allele. So in the heterozygous individual, we're going to see both versions of that gene expressed. Again, this isn't a different version. It's just showing that both of the red and the white gene are going to be expressed in our heterozygous individuals. So what we see with the complete, incomplete, and codominant versions is that the heterozygote really is what's going to help us determine the way that those genes are expressed, whether it's a complete dominant situation, an incomplete dominant, or a codominant situation. We want to look at that heterozygous individual. Another version that we have, and this is a lot more common than the either or, the two different versions of alleles, is what we call multiple alleles. And these are traits that are controlled by more than two versions of a specific gene. It kind of makes sense when we look at the coat color in dogs or hair color in humans for that matter. There's a lot of different versions. It's not just one or the other. And so a lot of the inheritance that we see, a lot of the gene expression that we see is controlled by more than one version of a gene. And so it's not just going to be tall or short or pink or red, and things like that. And so multiple alleles is more common than you might expect, and it makes that genetics a little bit more difficult. One of the really common ones that we'll see examples of is human blood type. There's 3 different versions of human blood type when we're talking about the ABO system. And what that is we have type A, type B, and type O. And the neat thing about human blood type is that it not only exhibits this multiple allele, the 3 different allele versions of human blood type, but it also shows a dominant and recessive trait. And so here we have A and B are going to be completely dominant, and then I is going to be recessive, the lowercase I, I'm sorry, here. And so A blood type and B blood type are dominant, and then type O, which is represented here by the lowercase I, is going to be our recessive type. And then on top of that, type A and B are also going to be codominant. So if you have the allele for the type A blood and the allele for type B blood, that's when we have the type AB blood. And so we see this quite frequently as an example of codominance, and we'll also see it really frequently as an example of multiple alleles. In another video later on, I'll go into what blood type is and what really determines blood type, but at least for this video, I want you to see that this is a common example of multiple alleles in humans. Another type of inheritance that I want to talk about is polygenic inheritance. And polygenic is just when a specific trait or characteristic is controlled by more than one gene. A lot of human genes are polygenic, and so there's multiple genes that control the way that certain things are expressed. A common one of that is going to be skin color. Skin color and eye color are controlled by what scientists believe to be at least 3 different genes. And so that explains a lot of the different variations that we'll see in skin color and eye color as well across the human species. But polygenic inheritance is where you've got more than one gene that's controlling your particular trait. And so this is just kind of showing those 3 particular genes that might be involved in skin pigmentation. And without going into Punnett squares and genetic predictions, this may not make much sense, but this is just kind of showing how those genes come together to actually affect skin pigmentation. And we'll go into monohybrid, dihybrid, and even some trihybrid crosses later on in some other videos. The last one that I want to talk about is what we call sex-linked traits. Sometimes these are referred to as X-linked traits. But really, when we say something is sex-linked, it's saying that the particular trait is controlled by genes that we find on a sex chromosome. When we learned about chromosomes in an earlier unit, we learned that, at least in humans, we have what we call autosomes, which are chromosome types 1 through 22, and then that 3rd chromosome type is what determines our sex, our X and Y chromosomes, and those are what we call our sex chromosomes. A sex-linked trait is just a trait that we find on either the X or Y chromosome. What you'll usually see when we talk about this in genetics is really referring to X-linked inheritance, or in this case, genes that are found on the X chromosome. And so a lot of times these will be interchanged, sex-linked and X-linked, when you first start learning about genetics, and that's why I bring them up together. But what I really want to focus on is what we would call an X-linked trait. A lot of the ones that we see in humans are recessive. And so in that case, what we see in this image here, we have our father. This larger chromosome here is our X chromosome. And it's going to have a normal version of a particular gene. And let's use hemophilia as an example. If you don't know what hemophilia is, it's a disorder that's actually passed down through X-linked inheritance, in which a person won't produce the necessary parts to cause blood clots, and so they can bleed out very easily. They don't have the ability to stop bleeding once blood vessels have been broken. And so in this case, our father is unaffected. He doesn't have the hemophilia trait. Over here we have a mother. Now, females in the human species have two X chromosomes. And so this female has the normal X chromosome without the hemophilia trait, and she also has an X chromosome that has the hemophilia trait on it. Well, in this case, this is a recessive gene, and so she's not exhibiting hemophilia. She's not a hemophiliac, so she has the ability to form blood clots. She can stop bleeding, but she can pass this trait down. And so if she was to pass this chromosome down, and that was to match up with, let's say, this Y chromosome from the father, and we end up with this son, remember we have an X and Y chromosome here, this son would have that hemophilia trait. And so we'll go into some sex-linked traits and patterns of inheritance when we do our Punnett squares with these later on, but I just kind of wanted to show you how that works here. We have our X and Y chromosomes. Our X-linked inheritance is when we're talking about traits that are on our X chromosomes here. Human females have two X chromosomes. Human males have an X and Y. When we do these sex-linked or X-linked traits, usually we'll focus on humans and fruit flies because there's some common traits that we can see in fruit flies that exhibit this type of inheritance. But other organisms don't necessarily have an X and Y chromosome. In fact, there are some organisms where the males only have one set of chromosomes. In bees, males only have one set. They're actually a haploid organism. So when we talk about sex-linked traits, a lot of times what we do is just focus on the human side of it because it's easy for us to see, but it does get a little more complex. Some things that I do want you to know about this, since males only have one X chromosome, they're going to have a higher chance of showing these X-linked traits because if this is a recessive trait, the female can have our normal version of the gene, and so it's going to be the dominant version, and so that would be expressed. Whereas in a male, if a male has the X chromosome with that recessive trait on it, he doesn't have another X chromosome to kind of cancel that out. He doesn't have the normal X chromosome there, and so if the recessive X-linked trait is on the chromosome, the male is going to exhibit it. And so with these X-linked traits, if they're recessive, males typically have a higher chance of exhibiting those traits. Another term that I want to go over here, we usually bring it up when we talk about X-linked traits, but it can be really referred to in any kind of autosomal passing down of traits as well, is the word carrier. In this case, you can see it in this image here where the mother is a carrier. Really, when we say carrier, we're just talking about an individual who carries that recessive gene. They're not showing it because they have a dominant allele as well, and that's what's going to be expressed. But they can pass that specific recessive gene down. And so in an X-linked situation here, we have the mother that's the carrier and she's passing this down. If she's carrying that recessive trait that's masked by a dominant one, we would still call her a carrier in that case. And so that's just another term that I want you guys to be familiar with. Hopefully that cleared some things up. In the next video, I want to just go over introductions to Punnett squares, really how to do some basic monohybrid crosses, and then we'll do some more videos later on going into some more of the complex versions of genetic predictions as well.